Well. Hello, everybody, to another IntelliGRC webinar. We're super excited today that you're here. I've got Ozzie and myself here kind of trying to run down stuff and work through what's going on with CMMC world. Ozzie is excited to be here too. Ozzie, you want to say hey?
Hey, everybody. How's it going?
All right. So really quickly, I just wanted to do some introductions about me. I am Steve Molter. I'm here at IntelliGRC. I was here for the last webinar doing it, and I'm CCP. I do some GRC consulting here. I do some engineering as well as trying to help organizations work through their own journeys with CMMC and other compliance frameworks. I really love this stuff, and I'm super excited about today's webinar.
Hey, everybody. Ozzie Saeed here. I'm the founder of IntelliGRC. My background is mostly in engineering and then in the federal government space, also NIST RMF and FedRAMP and things like that. So we're here. We're super excited. This is our new media room that we've just built out. So we're pretty excited. This is our first go around with it.
Yes. Lots of learning with what we're going to do. So I guess that leads us into some of the things that we're trying to do regarding our media content and whatnot to help us with that. I'm planning on doing a lot more blogs. We as a team are going to try to do a lot more blogs. I want to make sure that we're trying to not just do retroactive blogs of things that millions of people have already talked about, but we're trying to keep up to date. So be on the lookout for more blogs. We also are going to be starting to do a little bit more of a, using the new media room that we spent a lot of time setting up. We're going to be doing a lot more, maybe things like podcasts and stuff like that. A little bit more less formal, lighthearted, encouraging type of content for listeners and stuff to get you through your day, but also keep you informed and help you out, give you some perspective from industry leaders and things like that. So we're super excited about that. Today, our podcast or our webinar for today is really going to have just a few house rules. We want to make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to ask questions. We work in this stuff all the time. We love it to death. And so we also know that people have a lot of questions. And we have ourselves, we have questions, right? So we want to make sure that we're able to address as many questions as possible. So our questions will be moderated, and they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. We do have the awesome David Kwan Selalier in the chat helping and trying to address stuff. And David, I'm sorry if I botched your name after confirming that I pronounced it right earlier. And then, please use the Zoom QA, not the chat. I think we have the chat disabled. So use the QA to ask those questions. That way, David can kind of field them, moderate them, and you guys can upvote for the ones that, you guys want to see the most. So without further ado, let's get into the content. I mean, really a high level thing that we've seen a lot in the industry, and Ozzie, your perspective is going to be important to this too, is we've seen a lot of like DIB organization, like end organization, the contractor focused implication, which is super important. We totally affirm that. But we also see a desperate need to really help out the ESPs. In fact, that's been a huge driver of our recent service engagements and even developments in the app. So we've got, we want to kind of tackle the OSC's relationship with their ESP as kind of a more holistic approach to implementing the 32 CFR for what we're doing. So Ozzie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're trying to cover a critical point where I think most of the folks in the industry that are subject matter experts have just covered like what's changed, what does it mean for the OSC? And that's all fine and dandy, but what we're trying to make an emphasis on with today's webinar is any nuances that are like gotchas that you should be aware of because they're important, but also how does this affect everybody outside of the OSC, especially in the SMB community that uses external service providers like MSPs and cloud services. So I'm really excited to kind of cover this stuff.
Yeah, me too. So, I mean, just a couple points, we're going to be talking about things like the scoping adjustments. There have been quite a few of them. We'll try to cover as much as we can. Obviously, there's a million things that we could talk about. We're going to talk about the actual assessment requirements as opposed to the proposed rule. And then also what does it look like with this new emphasis on these customer responsibility matrices for all ESPs, not just CSPs anymore. And then we may touch on some interesting, as the community says, hot topics, as you will, and towards the end for sure. So let's dive into it. So talking about the scoping nuances for the OSC, I mean, Ozzie, I feel like there's been, at least in regards to the ESPs, what the OSC has been what has been forced on them is now they are responsible not just for protecting the data that they've been given from the government, but the data that protects the data that they've been given for the government. And we knew about this for a while, but the scoping nuances for the OSC is now kind of expanded more so beyond just protecting CUI. What do you think about that implication?
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, I think most of us in the industry have been kind of aware of this change coming, and also just the fact that you look at other frameworks in the NIST world, like RMF, that was already a common concept, right? Yeah. There just wasn't a proper term for SPA and SPD. SPD being relatively still new and not properly defined, but SPA, security protection assets, like there's already a concept of that in RMF. It's not defined the same. It's not the same term being used, but I think we kind of anticipated that. But I think what would be most important is understanding any clarity with the new rule as it relates to that, right? People tend to struggle with, I need to apply all of the same 110 requirements for CMMC level 2 to the SPAs. And so they ask questions like, do I need to do FIPS for SPA, right? So those are things that, I'm hoping we can kind of cover in here and clarify.
Yeah, I one of the things that, kind of jumping off what you just said, one of the things that I felt was probably the most helpful clarifier from the final rule related to SPAs was when you look at the scoping, like the scoping table in the level 2 assessments. They kind of change it a little bit for the level 3, but obviously the majority of the people we're talking to are focused on level 2. But they add this little addendum or a little extra fluff, if you will, to the assessor's requirements for security protection assets, where it says they're required to be assessed against all the CMMC requirements relevant to the security protections that they're providing. So there's a little bit of mercy or liberty there that I don't think there was before, where although the OSC for all their security protection assets, and we'll get into how that applies to ESPs, but for all their security protection assets, there's still the obligation that you apply all the 800-171 controls,
right,
wherever possible, right, across the board. But what's going to be assessed by the assessor is the kicker. Like, what does that look like for the FIPS thing, right? Are they really going to verify that FIPS mode is running on a SIEM provider when no CUI is going there?
Right.
Right. So, yeah, those are definitely big ones. Another nuance was, and I'm curious about your thoughts on it. I'll give you my take, and then I'm curious what you think about this new CRMA change, where the same language that the same language that applies to CUI assets, SPA assets, is now there for the CRMA assets. What do you take about this?
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think what's really interesting is in the early time with the last proposed rule language, but also just like the 2.0 assessment and scoping guide, it seemed like CRMA was a scapegoat for people to point to an asset and say, hey, this doesn't apply to me, right? I'm applying my own risk management methods and whatnot, but assessor, like, don't pay too much attention to this, right? Whereas this seems like a complete backpedal on that, right? It seems like the opposite now. which is very interesting, right? It kind of tells you there's something else going on behind the scenes, right? But yeah, I just think that if CRMA is now requiring very similar level of stringency and requirements that assessors may not have to, ignore it, right? They may want to start asking questions about it, right?
Right.
I'm not really sure what the value add is in keeping CRMA as a label then, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like why is it there? It's a little redundant. Right?
Yeah, we've seen that from other people in the industry. It's like, say the same thing. What if the requirements are the same, then is this really just some way to reduce what the assessor's burdened with assessing?
Right.
And I think that's literally what the DoD is saying. It's like, we expect you, because they say in one of the comments, all assets in scope are required to have the security requirements implemented, but we're taking a risk-based approach to what's prioritized in the actual assessment, or the assessment could hypothetically go on forever.
Right.
Right. So, yeah, no, I think that's a good point. The ESP thing on this one, and I know we have a lot to cover, but the ESP implication of this that I think, when we talk about ESPs, especially before the final rule dropped and those clarifications came, we're thinking mostly MSPs, MSSPs. ESPs, there was a big debate in the community about whether CSPs were to be lumped under that ESP, but now we know it is. So, so for CSPs that have some level of maybe data transfer of FCI, and they're using things like Entra ID SSO and stuff like that, there's no CUI going there. There's no security protection data going there. What are your thoughts on how to address ESPs, CSPs specifically, that have things like FCI, but don't have these other data types that per the DoD, they say if it doesn't store, process, or transmit FCI or CUI, then it doesn't meet the definition of ESP. Well, what about FCI, right? What about
SPA
that?
Even.
Well, yeah, SPA that doesn't have any kind of like data that it's working with, or logs or something like that. But yeah, what are your thoughts about like CRMA CSPs? Is that even a possibility at this point?
Yeah, so I think it is definitely a possibility, right? I think that CRMAs are there for use, right? So you can apply it to an ESP or an asset that's on-prem, right, or in your environment, right? So really the understanding that SPA, CUI, and ESPs, and then CSPs bundled in ESPs, are there for use, right? They're there for you to inform your assessors of the scope, right?
Yeah.
You need to label these things in maybe your SSP and your diagrams that your assessor then looks at and says, I understand what's the scope and what's involved.
Right.
In terms of like the ESPs, if it's even FCI data in that one example, right?
Yeah.
Let's say, hey, I'm using a product like Deltek products like CostPoint and whatnot. A lot of GovCon companies use that.
Right.
They'll store their contracts information, their financial aspects of those contracts, sometimes timesheet, payroll, what have you, right? Mm-hmm. So those things can be FCI. And in my opinion, it does not have the same requirements as CUI. But if you can verify that there's some flavor of security, implementation, because you still have the 17 requirements, right?
Right.
And
For
so
FCI.
you should be asking that vendor questions, right? You could and hey, if they have an SRM or grab their SOC 2 report that you can then vet it against the 17 requirements, then I would definitely recommend being prepared and doing that anyways, just in case.
Right. And that, I think we're going to get into that. What you just said is going to be a big deal, I think. So moving on to like what now the changes in the ESP scoping, one of the phrases that you see a bajillion times throughout the final rule is the ESP system themselves they don't need a CMMC assessment or a certification, but it does say over and over and over again that the services they provide are in scope for the OSA's assessment or the OSC's assessment. And that question to me is still, that raises more questions. What do they mean by that? Do they mean just, is the assessor only going to validate that if you say you provide SIEM SOC reporting to meet and they say they have a really good CRM that's really well defined, and they say they're supporting the implementation of these AU controls in 3.14.7 for the monitoring for unauthorized use and things like that. Are they just saying that the assessor is going to validate that that's actually happening, or are they going to also wonder, okay, what technicians from the MSSP is accessing that data, that SPD? Are they trained? Do they have a background check? Like all these different things. Like what is your take on this services provided kind of concept?
Yeah. So my thought is if you have, let's say in that example of like a SIM SOC provider, MSSP, I can see where you do want to have certain grounds defined in terms of like not my entire organization infrastructure as an MSSP is in scope, just the particular components that I'm using to provide said services to my OSC client.
Yeah.
That would be SPD, right? And so what I've noticed is that if you have a CRM and you're an MSSP, you probably should start thinking about, okay, relative to those system components that are providing said service to the OSC client.
Yeah.
Document for each of those requirements, hey, this is the status of inheritance. You can either fully, partially, et cetera. But also, I think the ESP, MSSP per se, could also define how they are making sure that this is components are scoped out of the rest of their organization and is intended to be used only for the service being provided. That's your opportunity to shine, right? That's your opportunity to show that you don't have to worry about the rest of my organization. You could just focus on just the components that are providing said service. So like a strategy that I've seen that I've been a fan of is where you have a SOC provider and then they've deployed a Sentinel instance, an Azure Sentinel instance on their client's environment, right?
Yeah.
Or within their client's tenants.
Yeah.
And they're using something like Azure Lighthouse, right, to remotely administer that, right,
check
solution,
for alerts and
right?
all that stuff. Yeah.
So that, and I think that's why Azure Lighthouse was even born in the first place, right? It's a way to address that on a technical level, some flavor of that segmentation. But yeah, that's how I would recommend it to the MSSPs out there is just be as transparent as possible and minimize the burden for your OSC clients to have to explain all of this. I don't think assessors should drill too deep into the external service provider.
Yeah.
And if that CRM or shared responsibility matrix looks like how I described, which
should
demonstrates
answer a lot of questions.
Correct, right?
Yeah. I agree. I just wonder, we have logical, what we've seen in the wild conclusions about a lot of this stuff. I'm just wondering if this is at the end of the day what the DoD is going to lay down in the law, because they responded to one of my LinkedIn posts saying that they're still coming up with some clarifications and stuff like that. I was like, okay,
clear as mud.
So I mean, so you started talking about the CRM concept, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit, because one thing that I felt a huge miss, and maybe the response that I'm going to get, some feedback that I'm going to get from me saying this is, well, it's outside of the scope of the rule and things like that, and maybe that's very well true. But like, you would think that if the DoD is requiring that all ESPs, all of them, have, regardless of whether a CSP, FedRAMP or not, that they have a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix, and a service description that describes the services they provide, which is what it says here. You would think that they would kind of go into detail about what the CRM needs to have in it, right? Yeah. You would think that they would talk about that more, or at least reference some kind of, like, how the 800-171 references a bunch of other NIST documentation to give guidelines for how to do something like risk assessments or something like that. You would think that they would do something like that for this, and it's a barren wasteland of information when it comes to customer responsibility matrices. So the first, like we have a couple slides here on CRMs, but the first thing is, from your perspective, and I'll give you my thoughts if you want, but from your perspective, who needs a CRM? Like who does, per the rule?
Right. So in my opinion, if there is a service being provided to the OSC and that service can be categorized, or that solution that's being used can be categorized as essentially a CUI asset, SPA asset, or CRMA even, right? I think the priority is going to be CUI and SPA, right, in that order.
I agree.
But essentially, that's going to be your easy decision tree, right? Is it this? If so, then probably needs it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's true. Well, and you mentioned CRMA based on probably that earlier portion of me mentioning FCI, but you're saying that it's about the data that's being protected. So if the OSC is, say, doing offsite backups to an MSP's data center, right? That would need a CRMA, not because CMMC per se requires backups like actually being taken. It does have a requirement to use FIPS validated cryptography to protect it at rest. But you're saying also if the services being provided by the ESP are helping them satisfy 800.171 controls or CMMC requirements. Is that like, am I getting that right?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that what I would also consider is focusing on not just the service that's being provided relative to like, is the CUI involved? Is SPA and SPD involved? Right. So on and so forth. I also think that another alternative approach that I've seen that not a lot of people talk about, but is an easy solution for like, say, consultants like RPOs or even MSPs, is to minimize the connectivity or the ongoing persistence of connectivity between your systems and your OSC client systems.
Yeah.
And so think of like, if you're a consultant, you ask the OSC client to give you a laptop from their managed environment.
Yes.
Right. You use their emails, their laptops. I think MSPs could take a playbook out of that. Right.
Yeah.
Like we need solutions that, okay, if there's an RMM tool for remote maintenance and management, maybe there's an anchor server component that you deploy at the client's environment, whether it be in their Azure cloud or on-prem, what have you, right? And your team is simply federating identities or somehow given unique identities on your client's environments to access those environments. So then you can kind of keep yourself a little bit out of scope to a degree.
That's what we do.
Right? Yeah. So yeah, that would be like, I'm mentioning it because I don't think a lot of people think that way.
Yeah,
right?
There's a new thing in the rule that helps with that even more, right? The VDI thing we'll get to in here in a second.
Yep.
The only other thing I wanted to ask, and we'll go into the next slide, really is at a high level, getting more so into like the details of the CRM, because we really do think that that's an important thing that many MSPs, like we're talking to some now, that not speaking poorly of them, they just don't know what a CRM should have in it. But is the CRM, before we get into the nitty-gritty details of a CRM, should it be pertaining to the services they provide or should it also, like you said earlier, should it also include details of what they're doing to implement controls on their system components that are kind of isolated to support those services being provided? Like, for example, hot and cold storage for logs and the SIEM server or the SIEM CSP that they're using to support them. Yeah.
So I think that it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is does the service provider need to have specific criteria for a CRM to be sufficient, right? We don't know the answer in the CMMC world, right? There's no minimum sufficiency in the CMMC realm, at least in terms of like a consensus amongst C3PAOs on this is what I'm looking for. Like minimally, you have to have these columns, right?
We can surmise what they're kind of used to seeing, like with the FedRAMP CIS workbooks and the CRM workbooks. But you're saying we don't have a rigid guideline, which is
right.
Yeah.
There's no minimum acceptance criteria that's publicly known, right? So when it comes to what we recommend our clients and partners out there, right, is the more the merrier, right? So if you start off with the basics of looking at a FedRAMP CSP's CRM, right, say Microsoft Office 365 or Azure, they already say this is what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
And they also say the level of inheritance or the state of inheritance, which is you can fully inherit this, partially or not at all.
Right.
And then they'll also supplement it with, here's what you got to do on your end. Here's what you're responsible for. So I think that would be my suggestion on minimum criteria.
Yeah.
And I understand that some ESPs will be cognizant or cautious of, well, I don't want to show them exactly what I'm doing because that's my risk, right? And that's fine. But if you pay attention to the FedRAMP CRM from Microsoft, they already do a great job at saying what they do, but so generically worded that it's also not auditable, right?
Right.
And I'm confident their SSP is different, right? It's gonna, their implementation details in their SSP for their assessors are going to go down the nitty gritty details, but the CRM is more obfuscated, and so I think that's what I would do, right? Because in theory, if you share a CRM, you could even associate it to like a contractual agreement, right? So it's binding.
Yeah.
Right. And say, hey, I'm committing to you that this is what I'm doing on my side. This is what I'm saying you can or cannot inherit or partially can inherit. And here's some guidance on what you should probably do on your end relative to what it is that you're getting.
Right. The guidance piece is huge.
And I think the cloud services is much more straightforward on here's the recommendations, like go in your admin portal of this cloud service and configure the password complexity or session timeout requirements or enable MFA. But for an ESP, that's going to be a little different, right? The context is very different.
Right.
It's more of like, hey, we don't do this stuff for your environments and your assets.
Right. I literally set up a SIEM. I set up alerts and reports. I forward you the alerts. I'll cover these controls. Boom. That's it. I'm not worried about, awareness and training and stuff like that. So that was another piece. And this is like my recommendation. And I've talked to several MSPs. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Like, I recommend that MSPs, MSSPs, and even CSPs have a CRM that's unique to the services that their customers, if they do it this way, that their customers purchase from them. If there are unique ones that they can purchase, like there are several options.
Right.
That way, the customer can in their onboarding packet or whatever it is that they're getting from the MSP or whatever it is, they know exactly, hey, for my environment and for the services that I'm purchasing from you, please, that I know that I can take this Excel document or whatever it is and populate that information, at least reference it into my MSP and hand that over to my C3PAO and know that it's going to cover what I actually purchased from you, instead of some really unique, very high detailed CRM that says, if you use this service, this service, this service, this service, this service, you know what I mean? Because there's a little bit of that in some of the CSP CRMs out there, for sure.
Yeah. And I think one thing I was going to add to that, that's a great point, is it's going to be advantageous for the ESP, whether they're a cloud service or they're a managed service provider, whatever they are, right, to bundle what it is they offer into these packages, right? So like, if I've seen a lot of mature MSPs out there create bundles that says, here's this package, it's priced at X dollars per person, per endpoint, per month, right? And it's like, it includes phone management, includes antivirus, includes patching, includes break fix support, whatever, right? And they call it a name, right? They give it a label as a SKU, right? And this is the package we're selling. They can build the CRM templates on their end for those different packages. And that way it's more clear, hey, you don't have this said package, which doesn't include that service, so I'm not going to waste your time explaining what I'm doing for that service that you're not even using, right?
Yeah.
But also, the thing that I'm noticing is that a lot of folks are taking what I call the intellectual lazy route, right?
We are very familiar here at IntelliGRC of what intellectual lazy is.
It's just a term that I constantly use out of frustration, which is the ESP is taking shortcuts on just like blanket statements, and they may not want to do this extra paperwork of templatizing specifically per service package they sell a CRM, right? But in my opinion, your job as a service provider, the reason why they came to you is to either A, save themselves time because they outsourced it,
right,
or B, feel that level of comfort and safety for the things that it is that you provide. Right?
Yeah.
And so if you're adding work back on the OSC's plate, you need to take a good hard look in the mirror and say, am I really providing the best service I can to my customers?
Yeah.
Right? Don't add work to their plate. Be transparent. Make it easy for them to digest.
That is huge, and that actually does lead into the next thing: is what do you do about those external service providers? Not that just are, or not just that they're intellectually lazy, but that just have no clue or don't have anything at all related to responsibility matrices. Like obviously they have most of them will have their SLAs and their service agreements and the contract itself and things like that, the MSA or something like that. But what do you do about those MSPs, MSSPs, and cloud service providers that just have nothing?
Oh yeah,
but are like integral to your guys' operations.
Yeah. So Steven and myself and many others on the IntelliGRC team have sat in and supported multiple joint surveillance voluntary assessments.
Yes.
And we've gotten experience across our team across 3 C3PAOs. Okay. So one thing that I've noticed is this is a common situation we run across where the OSC may have an external service provider, a cloud service provider that meets the SPA criteria, for example. Mm-hmm. And they're like, yeah, those guys don't even know what CMMC is, right? They don't have a CRM for CMMC, right? Yeah. And they're not FedRAMP.
Clueless.
Right? So those things don't exist in ISO 27001, PCI DSS, or SOC 2, right? SOC 2 reports, right? Which are the common things, and you see from a cloud service provider saying, here's how you could trust the security posture of my environment for the services I provide you, right? That's the common industry use case. But the problem is none of those things talk about a CRM, right?
That's great.
And so what I've always done and what we've done here at IntelliGRC, as you know, is we've still advised our OSC, even as consultants, and we even, like, again, from the perspective of saving our OSC clients time, we'll ask them to go and find whatever security relevant documentation or information they can find from that service provider.
Right.
And most mature cloud service vendors have a trust portal, right? Some kind of trust services portal or compliance web page on their website.
Don't, it's probably not a good idea.
And oftentimes you can ask them for these questions, right? Ask your account manager or the sales reps, can you give me a copy of your SOC 2 report? And they'll say, yeah, sign this NDA here, we'll give it to you. And so what we've said is get those artifacts and have them on hand and be ready, right? It's also equally important for the OSC to understand what they're saying, right? And what they're doing on their end when it comes to security. And we still even take it a step further. Some might even call it overkill, but I call it over-prepared for an assessment, which is developing a home-built CRM, right? And what I mean by that is you'll take that cloud service vendor's SOC 2 report and try to reverse engineer by doing maybe a control F for keywords in the practices, right? Like password complexity. Look up password in the SOC 2 report, and then try yourself to define what it is they're doing.
Right. To get something.
And then look at that cloud service portal's admin settings and see if you can configure any of those things. And then document that as well.
For the customer responsibility side.
Correct. This is what we're doing. Hey, they let me go ahead and set the minimum password length in the admin portal of this cloud service. And so this is what I did, right? And some people say that's a lot of paperwork, a lot of overkill, but it has come in handy with the JSVAs at times, right? Like when we start showing them we have these SOC 2 reports and all these things, and then we built our own CRM, they're actually impressed. And they're also like, it minimizes them asking questions because they know how focused you are on trying to cover all your bases.
Right, yeah, and that is like one of our mottos here is let's do things when we're helping people, let's do things that are going to make the assessor ask less questions than more. And that experience in the JSVA was kind of mind-blowing because you don't see that spelled out anywhere.
No.
But it is like the logical conclusion. If I can show in these documents that they're doing this for like, and also on top of the 3120 requirement where you're supposed to, verify the use of these systems. Well, one of the most fundamental ways of doing that is making sure that this isn't some rogue CSP, but I have a contract with them and I have security documentation to verify that they're legit and that I can at least apply some security protections to them, for sure.
Yeah, quick shameless plug for IntelliGRC. So IntelliGRC being a SaaS GRC product, that is exactly why we built our CRM functionality. So there's a concept in our assets scoping of the workflow in the tool.
Right.
That you define your external interconnections, right? These are your external service providers. And you can also import and export a CRM and
Yes.
build it yourself where it auto-populates your SSP with that information.
Yes, dude, and it's funny, people have used that for things not in the IntelliGRC app, right? They've used it for just internal personal use for like MSPs that we're working with who are trying to build out one that they can give as like part of their technical documentation or white papers or something like that for their customers. So yeah, super good. So yeah, I think that's really good information, and I think it's one of those things we don't have clearly defined, and we do our best.
Right.
We want to do our best. So some of the other ESP considerations that we wanted to touch on is, especially with the changes in the assessment requirements, especially. You see over and over in the final rule, and I've spent a lot of time with the final rule, where it says, if the services provided don't process, transmit, or store CUI, then it doesn't require, we said this earlier, it doesn't require certification. The MSP doesn't require certification.
Yep.
But it says that their services providers are in scope for the assessment. So what do you think about, and I'm curious what others in the chat and things like that think, what is the perspective, and what have you seen in the wild about like MSPs having to show up to assessments? I know I have some comments on that, like actually showing up to the assessments. I know we haven't really had CMMC assessments, but we have had DIBCAC and C3PAO assessments. What have you seen?
Yeah. So in the JSVAs, if it was a CSP, we were able to use the CRM and all of those other artifacts, like a copy of their FedRAMP report or whatever they have, SOC 2, et cetera.
Right.
And we have not obviously had to have them at the table because that would be very difficult.
Yeah, that would.
However, on the MSP side, we have seen that they expect that, right, in the JSVAs, where they expect that MSP, who is acting like an extension of your organization, your IT department, having to be there to explain things, right?
Right.
I think it really just comes down to the level of involvement that ASP has in the OSC's environment that's handling CUI, right?
Yeah.
If it's an SPA and it's this, SOC service, and that we talked about Azure Lighthouse and Sentinel and that approach, right? I think you could possibly start off with the CRM from that vendor, right? And then go from there. I don't anticipate, again, we don't know. I don't anticipate that type of arrangement will require that MSSP to sit there and join the assessment. But if they are in your environment more frequently, like in MSP, I can see that definitely being a need.
Yeah, like personal experience, right? We've seen a company that had an MSP that it was a fundamental aspect of the assessment itself that they were there. Right, if they had not been there, they would not have passed the assessment.
Right,
like because it was just the level, and especially, and this was a DIBCAC assessment, right? So DIBCAC was like, and obviously there's some variance in the DIBCAC perspective, but it was like, if this MSP is not here and they have this level of access to your system, then by default, you don't meet these certain controls. And we saw that. We saw that firsthand, that certain controls that you wouldn't even think that it would apply to the MSP,
right,
apply to them. Now, I'm hopeful that C3POs who are much more intimate with CMMC are going to be a little bit more rational.
Right.
But, and not to say that every aspect of that was irrational, but it's, like a person in the comments put, right? They can't dedicate their time to their customers' cybersecurity audits,
right,
all the time. Like it's just
not scalable.
Not scalable. Exactly. So moving on. I wanted to reach back to something you said earlier. The final rule it was a huge win for the final rule to address the VDI thing.
Yeah.
And talking about MSPs specifically, that's a huge thing for OSCs that are trying to use an enclave approach where they just spin up something like a Microsoft 365, Windows 365 VM, or an Azure virtual desktop, and then disable all the RDP redirections. I wrote a blog or a LinkedIn post about it. That's a huge win. But it's also a huge win for MSPs who maybe have a team dedicated to like DIB customers,
Right.
and want to be able to, reduce how they're involved, but still be able to provide some white glove services to their customers. How do you think MSPs and ESPs can reduce scope in addition to like that VDI thing?
Yeah. So I think that let's just focus on like an MSP, which is like the more common set of challenges, right? MSPs and MSSPs, right? So I do think that going back to that strategy we talked about, which is deploy solutions closest to the environment of the customer.
It's
right?
possible in your DMZ.
if you can use their identities, great. If you need to federate it, fine, right? But find where it would be most beneficial to your OSC customers, right? This should be a value add, right, to what you're providing your customers. Is that not only am I helping you with the service I'm providing, but I'm also making sure you can remain compliant. So I do think like that strategy of deploying like an anchor server or VDI, right, in the closest to the OSC's environment is a great solution. Backup offerings, which you always see in the MSP world.
Yeah,
I think that a strategy there is simple as let the OSC hold the storage location, like especially if they can use something like Azure, right, and use like a storage instance in Azure that the OSC has as part of their tenant, right?
Separate subscription or separate region, something.
And all you're really doing is managing the statuses and the rules and the settings of those backup jobs, right? But the target isn't anything in the MSP's environment or in the MSP's control. So that's kind of what I think would be the most beneficial approach to reducing scope on the MSP side.
Yeah. The other thing that I was going to say, and that's our third bullet on this one, which I think is important, because there's a question in the CMMC FAQ that's a little bit concerning, where somebody asks, okay, we have CUI, it's stored in the cloud, and our MSP administers it, and they say, is the MSP going to be considered a CSP, and therefore does that MSP have to have FedRAMP, a moderate authorization or something like that, or equivalency? And they actually say it depends. The FAQ says it depends. It says they say it depends on the relationship between the CSP, the MSP, and the OSA. If the cloud tenant is subscribed or licensed to the OSA directly, even if the MSP resells the service, then the MSP is not a CSP. But if the MSP contracts with the CSP and further modifies the basic cloud service, then the MSP is a CSP and must meet the FedRAMP requirements.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That is.
So my suggestion, based on that, I know that the FAQ is not the rule itself, but it kind of gives what DoD's perspective is on things.
Yeah.
My suggestion is, as part of your MSP practice with DIB companies, like, let them be the owner of stuff. Like kind of what you were saying. Let them be the owner of stuff, and you simply be pretty much a staff augmentation where possible. I know there are some things that are kind of out of our control, but that's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think some things to wrap up the main content is I did see that there were some clarifications on the FedRAMP requirements. We know that only CSPs need to be FedRAMP, and what is the actual definition of an ESP, and then what should ESPs do in relationship to their DIB customers in regards? I think the main thing we wanted to get to on this one was, is it better to get certified, or is it better to self-attest and develop and implement your own internal documentations like the CRM and just have it ready, or should a company go and get some C3PO assessment if they're an MSP or something like that?
Yeah. So I would say if you're supporting a DIB company that is seeking to get certified with CMMC, you should still prepare yourself, right? So at a minimum, I would take the 800-171 or the CMMC level 2 requirements, right, and apply them internally. Right?
Yeah.
As much as you can, with the exception of maybe some of the CUI specific requirements like FIPS, right?
Yeah.
Those are very expensive and they do not scale well, right? So at a minimum, focus on everything else, right? Why? Because a lot of that stuff is best practices anyways, right?
Yeah.
And you should have some security posture. Then I would develop a CRM, and that would be my 2 minimum criterias. If somebody says, should I get certified or not? You don't have to. As an ESP,
That's spelled out.
MSP, not handling CUI. But it is a business differentiator, right? So it's a strategic reasoning to say,
they say that,
that, hey, I have a certification. So there's less animosity or less confusion or less uncertainty on my own practices.
And you have an
right?
assessment report.
And I have an assessment report I can provide you. What's the difference of that in equivalency with FedRAMP, right? The body of evidence, right? You could do something like that too. So I tell folks it's a strategic thing, right? It'll make your sales guys happy because it's one less thing they have to counter in a rebuttal.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good. One more slide that I wanted to really quickly touch on is I know many people have not had a chance to read through the rule itself and maybe even the FAQs and stuff like that. But there were some interesting conflicts that I wanted to get your thoughts on really quickly. So there is a comment, and I know it's just a comment, right? But it does kind of, like I said earlier, it kind of speaks to where DoD's head's at on some of this stuff. But they said that the security protection data requires protection commensurate with that of CUI and based on how and where that data is stored. Therefore, the FedRAMP requirements apply. So it's a comment, and we know that there's a big chart actually in the rule that says if it's just SPD, it's just the services provided that are in scope for assessment. But why do you think that they would even say it like that?
Yeah, I think that's a remnant from the prior stance, right?
Yes.
The remnant from the proposed rule before it became the most recent final, right? There was this constant confusion, right, where DoD was saying, no, we should do that because in RMF they do, right? In RMF, if there's a security protection asset, it does need to comply with the exact same controls as whatever the data types you're protecting in your FedRAMP package, right? So that's a common practice in the government anyways. So I think it's just a remnant, and I think my stance is it's just a FAQ. It's just a comment. It's not the rule itself, and it's not the framework and standard itself.
And you can argue that with an assessor. No, I totally agree. And I think we have several questions, and I want to make sure we're cognizant of being able to work through questions that come in. So we'll move on to the QA time. So David, can you unmute and kind of read out some of these questions?
Yeah, sure. So a few slides ago, you guys were talking about VDI, and one of the high upvoted questions here is IntelliGRC seems excited about VDI. Any good examples of CMMC compliant enclaves already out there? Know of any open source or publicly accessible info on its implementation? Army Encode is an example of a push for that, but it's early in the process. What are you guys' thoughts?
I mean, so when it comes to specific enclave solutions, I can think of a couple that are specifically marketing for CMMC as an enclave approach. Guys like Point North Networks are guys that we've worked with, and we see that they are really dedicated to doing this right. I think Carter Schronberg.
Yeah, Soundwave. Yeah, they've got a cool solution.
Yeah, they got a solution out there. One thing though, from as a Microsoft lover, I mentioned Windows 365 earlier, but before I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. But Windows 365 for internally built enclaves that are isolated from maybe your corporate infrastructure to like a GCC or GCC high tenant, that's a good solution because you can just enforce the Intune RDP redirect settings to block all that, and it's Intune managed or GPO managed if you have like an Azure based domain control or intra domain services. Like there's several solutions out there that this does open up a world of options for you. I mean, what are your thoughts, Ozzie?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think enclaves VDI type solutions out there. There's a lot of them, right? And they're great, right, for the use cases they support.
Yeah.
But I will say the caveat is it's also a very niche use case. So if you're talking like manufacturing sector,
yeah,
that is probably not the best solution, right? Because of the fact that the on-prem infrastructure, right, is so commingled with the data, right? So I think that it's a good use case. I am actually very excited about the Army ENCODE solution. That's been a conversation they've been having for a while. In fact, I think the National Guard even had one at the National Guard Bureau many, many years ago for contractors, right? And even from my experiences working as a contractor, we've always pushed the government, give us your GFEs, give us your laptops. We don't want to.
We don't want your
do
stuff.
that, right? And I think it makes sense that if the contractor is providing staff aug or professional services, yeah, put them in an environment that's government, right? That's government furnished.
It's under an ATO, and
it's so much less risk. It's so much easier to do, right? And so yeah, I'm excited that the government's already looking in that direction. And I hope it works out.
Yeah, I concur.
Follow-up question here. Any thoughts specifically on Lifeline VDI or Fast Track?
Yeah, absolutely. They're actually.
I think I know who these questions are coming from.
They're actually a good partner and friend of ours. Very similar solution. Absolutely. And you know what I really like about some of these solutions, like even like Fast Track from Lifeline data centers, is that they're not only just pairing the access to a operating system and all the settings and the configuration of the infrastructure around it.
Yeah.
They're also providing like almost vCISO support, right?
As they go
for that environment. So it's like a full suite to get you compliant, right? It's like 80% ready to go, right? And then there's some nuances to be addressed, but those are much more digestible and consumable than the entire portion of all of the requirements, right? So
yeah, I agree.
All right. Looping back towards the beginning, you guys are talking about CRMs and SSPs and all that. Somebody put in, based on the discussion you guys were having, are you suggesting that MSPs have two separate systems? One system SSP that would be in scope for the MSP's internal systems, and a second system SSP that focus on the service they provide. You know, are we looking at multiple SSPs here?
So I have a take on it based on one of our partners. I won't say who. But they're working through how they're going to implement some of this stuff. And they actually did go through a C3PAO assessment because they're an MSP that also is a GovCon. And so they actually do have an enclave for their MSP services to their customers, but then they have their commercial, their enterprise SSP and attestation from the C3PAO and their assessment report and all that stuff for their enterprise. So it depends. I guess the answer to follow off of what the DoD made us so happy with saying, it depends, right? Like if you're an MSP that wants to, and I think this is a common thing that we at IntelliGRC really try to emphasize, is security shouldn't come at a premium. I think should be a guarantee. It should be a guarantee. And one thing to show that you're doing that is if your whole system is ready to go, right? If the people who are coming in, your HR have procedures for making sure that people are screened properly, that are going to be techs that are touching your stuff. Like it just depends, right? If you also don't have, if you're an MSP that is trying to be careful about costs and you want to be solid and have a quick and easy and understandable assessment that doesn't, cause scope creep into other things that you don't want to have to specifically worry about, and you make sure that you have those isolation techniques, maybe there is a use case for you guys having two separate scopes, two separate boundaries in IntelliGRC, two separate SSPs and things like that.
Yeah, no, I think like kind of like that analogy of if you've ever been in the IT industry, the person who has the most wisdom is the person whose answer is that depends, right? And there's a reason for that, right? It's because there's always 1,000 ways to skin that cat, right? Yeah. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think there are going to be nuances of consideration relative to what is the best for what it is you do, right? So I've seen it in that situation where the service provider, like an MSP, has two environments, their internal environment, and then they have an enclave environment that's just for their DIB customers. I think that sounds fine and dandy, but I always push back on that.
Yeah.
I push back on that. Why? Because I actually think it'll result in less security.
Right.
Overall.
Definitionally.
Why? Because you increased your overhead and complexity of two separate environments that need to be managed differently.
Right.
Right? So you're adding more overhead to your own cost and labor, right? But also now because of that, you are less likely to maintain it in a good state, right?
Right.
There's going to be drifts of focus, right? Because humans, naturally, we get distracted so easily.
It's already hard enough to do it for one environment.
100%.
Yeah.
So I always tell folks, like, hey, if you're an MSP that doesn't handle CUI at all as part of your services and the scope of the services you're providing, why not just apply all of the requirements to your entire environment, right? And sure, because it's not CUI, you could skip the FIPS and all those specific CUI requirements, right? You could address it a little differently, right?
You can talk about SPD data flow maybe and things like that.
Instead of CUI. And just be transparent. Like we decided not to do FIPS because we don't handle our customer CUI. We do SPA, which uses modern encryption methods, right? So I say that I think that's going to be the one that's going to be the easiest to sell in the industry. Because again, going back to that analogy of security's shouldn't be a premium. It should be a guarantee, right? It's like if cars started to decide, if car manufacturers decided to start charging for seat belts, right, separately, like, oh, that's a premium upgrade.
Doesn't your Tesla charge?
There's a reason why that's a federal mandate, right? Like, why should this be any different? Information is our livelihood and our security, right? Why should this be any different? That's why I frown upon people who want to charge me more for MFA integrations, right? So at the end of the day, I also will say this is another reason why I frown at vendors as big as Microsoft even, right? Because what are you telling your consumers?
Right.
I have this product that is less secure, and then I have one that's going to guarantee security. Which one do you want to buy? Like, excuse me.
Well, okay.
Why would I ever say yes to that?
I'm not trying to get into politics here, but there are some added infrastructure costs and things like that to support different features. But like SSO in your app, like, come on.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying is I understand the complexity of like FedRAMP and FIPS. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about just the minimum of like password complexity
stuff.
All of the technical requirements, right? Like, why wouldn't an MSP be doing incident response testing annually for the services they provide? Isn't that critical to their business?
Yeah.
They should look at it as more of protecting their intellectual property and their business as well.
And if they have a SOC 2 report, I mean, you guys that you have a public perception that you've got to maintain. Like why would you risk that by divesting it very important security mechanisms from, the poor people's version?
Right.
Exactly.
All right, guys, I think we got just a few minutes left. We might be able to get through one more question before we start running out of time here. There's a couple in the chat, and while we may not be able to get to everybody's question, we can certainly reach out if you get in touch with us. But I do see a really, really nice one here. Any thoughts on the FAR CUI clause? Do we have a plan for versioning conflicts between NIST 800-171 Revision 2 and Revision 3?
So I'll do the FAR, you do the Rev 2, Rev 3 thing, and I'm assuming they're talking about in the app for Rev 2, Rev 3, right?
Yeah, probably. And again, we're down to our last couple minutes here, so.
Oh, we're fine. We're fine. So for the FAR clause, it's a real thing. We've seen it coming from afar off, and it's not stated anywhere, but we think that the CMMC program is it's the model. It was the sandbox for a federal-wide approach to it. I'm not saying that CMMC is what is going to be applied everywhere, but I'm certainly not saying it's out of the realm of a possibility. So I would say, CUI across the board. I've seen contractors that have CUI from NASA that doesn't have to be protected against 800-171 because NASA doesn't all have defense contracts, or at least they don't have one with NASA that's under the defense contracts. So, my thoughts are. Be ready to just apply 800-171, and if it goes as far as Rev 3 for the FAR CUI rule, which I would surmise that it will by the time that the FAR CUI rule is live, it will be at least Rev 3. Be thinking and internally talking and engineering ways to satisfy the nuances of Rev 3 versus Rev 2, and then over to you for how we're handling that in the app.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, yes, we will be doing versioning between the two, right? We're already working on that.
Yeah.
Even features like ODVs, right? Being able to define that. So, yeah, we'll definitely have support for it in the app. Yeah.
All right, guys.
I think we're at the top now. So
Yeah, we are. Thanks, guys, for coming. We are loved having everybody. I'm super glad about the questions. So we'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.